So now we're going to talk about mass communication and culture, which is a huge topic and is definitely could be its own major, not let alone its own class. Uh, but as the book does, and we'll keep talking about this again during the course. We're just going to kind of talk about the theme here and what it means. So first, what is culture? This is right from your book, Stanley Barron, The Learned Behavior of Members of a Given Social Group. Socially constructed shared meaning. Function and effects of culture. Limits our options and provides guidelines. Sometimes its limiting effects can be negative. There are dominant cultures, mainstream cultures, and then there are other cultures underneath the dominant culture. Um, Here's another quotation about what culture is, again pulled from the book. An historically transmitted pattern of meanings embodied in symbolic forms by means of which people communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes towards life. Symbolic forms. Interesting, it's pretty deep. Pattern of meanings embodied in symbolic forms by means of which people communicate, perpetuate, and develop their knowledge about and attitudes toward life. I would think here about you remember in the first class we talked about Simone Biles and what had happened to her in these latest Olympics. This is a woman who's been touted as the greatest gymnast of all time, having mental difficulties competing, and how she decided to drop out from most of her events, all except one, I think. And she won the bronze medal in the one that she did compete in. And so we also importantly made the point that if it had been 5 or 10 years ago, her decision to withdraw based on mental concerns, emotional concerns, would not have been greeted positively by most of the press and most of society. But she's a symbol, isn't she? It's one of the reasons she had so much pressure on her, is that she was a symbol of many things. But the meaning of what she went through changed. So we could say that the culture, which she's a part, let's just call it America, was one big part of the culture. People who love sports, I suppose, is another part of the culture. People who watch current events is another culture. They had developed their attitudes about mental health. And so this symbol and what the symbol went through in the Olympics was interpreted in new ways by the culture. And there's a new attitude towards life, towards mental health, that was there in the culture, that reflected back to her, and that she probably moved ahead. So for someone of her, quote, stature, unquote, unquote, her fame, her import, to have done what she did and then get a positive response would, I think, move ahead the society's, the culture's attitudes about mental health. So that's a concrete example of the definition. Culture. It's a small world after all. This ride, those of you I would ask in class now, those of you who've been to Disneyland or Disney World or Disney something, to raise your hands. My daughter's still angry that we managed to raise her without taking her to Disneyland or Disney World. If you did go to one of those places, you may have gone on the ride. It's a Small World After All, which is about celebrating all these different cultures, but that after all, we're all just folks. So one way to think about culture is all these different countries, right? And all the countries' customs and attitudes and music and dress, and that's what you see in It's a Small World After All, is all these different customs by geography, I would say. Here's another geographic cultural separation. I was poking around and looking for maps of things that were going on in the U.S. To show you, and came up with this 11 regions underlying the 50 states, which is kind of interesting. And it basically says that there are types of people who live in these areas. And so it's not determined by state, it's determined kind of by a broader geography, a looser, broader geography. And that this is one way to look at the United States. And each one of these colors, each one of these Far West, Yankeedom, Midlands, Greater Appalachia, each one of these is a culture where people have a lot of similarities. And you can read about each one of these. But let's see, Yankeedom, which is in the upper right. You'll see it goes from Maine kind of down through Michigan and up through Minnesota. As a Puritan legacy, perfect earthly society with social engineering, individual denial for common good, assimilate outsiders, vigorous government to thwart would-be tyrants. So those are characteristics according to this person's map. So very interesting. There's the Deep South. There's the Spanish Caribbean, way down at the bottom of Florida. There's New France, just in the area of New Orleans. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Here's another. We're going to look at a couple of different breakdowns of cultures now. I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of talking about different types of cultures. This is a tribal map of Afghanistan. It's in the news these days. And I think it's been said more than once that many of these countries in the Middle East were not really countries. They were kind of put together. In some cases, a country like Iraq was just a geographic boundaries which were set by the British back in the early 20th century, and that the countries really aren't countries. I mean, they're just inventions of the Brits. Okay, and then what really dominates in terms of kind of the key organizations everyone feels a part of. In other words, I don't feel like I'm necessarily an Iraqi. I don't feel like I'm necessarily in the country of Afghanistan. I'm in the Dai Zangi tribe. I'm in the Daikundi tribe. Okay, so here are the tribes in Afghanistan, which I think it's fair to say each tribe is its own culture, right, with its own rules and everything. Here's a tribal map of the United States, obviously before Europeans started settling. And each one of these tribes was its own culture, right, with its own language, many times its own religion, its own customs. So there's another geographic look at culture. And then, of course, I was curious, so I couldn't help but do another U.S. map. And these are, I'm not sure of the year of this, but this is a look at Native American reservations. This is where Native Americans now, many of them live. Tribal lands that are not under the jurisdiction of different states. They have kind of a quasi-independent status, but you can see it's a lot less land than our Native American tribes used to have, isn't it? So beyond geography, of course, there are other ways to divide people by culture. We're now going to talk about a very important concept in marketing called segmentation. I teach this a lot in my direct marketing and my database marketing classes. And what this means is that we take a population and divide it into segments based on demographics or psychographics. Okay, so what you can think about here is think of the customer database for Amazon. I would imagine most of you shop at Amazon. Amazon has tens of millions of customers, but one of the things Amazon wants to understand is, does it have different segments? In other words, does it have a certain segment of older customers, retirees, and what kinds of products do they buy? What do they have in common in terms of beliefs? And can Amazon kind of separate those folks as one segment and send special communications to them with special product offerings and get more business from them? Okay, so this is the idea of taking a general population, maybe geographically, but dividing them into psychographic and demographic segments. There is a resource called PRISM, which stands for Potential, I didn't even know, forgot what it stood for, Potential Ranking Index for Zip Marketing. So this is what would be called a third-party research tool. They look at the whole U.S. population and they try to divide it into similar groups. Not so much based on necessarily on state by state or city by city, but based, in other words, looking at people as different segments. Okay, and they've defined 68 demographically and behaviorally distinct types, which they call clusters. Okay, we could call them cultures. Okay, here is an example of a PRISM group. Wealthy, mature, without kids. And here's a description of them. Opulent standard of living, driving expensive cars, frequently eating out and traveling. Here are some of the demographic traits. Right, age, wealthy, millionaires. Here are their lifestyle and media traits. They own a Lexus, they eat at Bonefish Grill, follow men's tennis, watches Fox Business, listens to news. Okay, here's another group, the young digerati, wealthy, middle-aged, mostly with kids. Tech savvy, live in fashionable neighborhoods on the urban fringe, affluent, highly educated. Many have chosen to start families. And here's the demographic traits, and here's lifestyle traits. They own a Mercedes, they eat at Chipotle, they shop at Banana Republic, go hiking back then. So here's another culture. Okay, so there's this. There are lots of cultures out there. And many of us, most of us, are going to be members of an overall kind of grand uber culture, so to speak, like America. But then we may be members of other cultures as well. And each one of these little things in the diagram is a group, is a culture. Okay, I'm going to stop here.